So, muchas gracias, bienvenidos al canal de YouTube del Instituto Cervantes de Leeds in Manchester. Good evening and welcome to the YouTube channel of the Instituto Cervantes Leeds and Manchester. Today we have the fifth event of our series on bilingualism, which has been designed with the support and coordination of Dr. Villa Garcia, who is senior lecturer at the University of Manchester. His field of research is focused on this subject, and he will introduce our special guest, Carmen Parafita-Couto, who is lecturer at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. So thank you, Julio, thank you, Carmen, for being with us tonight, and thank you to our audience. For us, it's a great pleasure to have you, and this series is very important because we try with this analysis of the different aspects of bilingualism to put the stress of the importance of the knowledge of different languages, because it's not only the knowledge of new languages, but also our new ways of living, because each language is like the door to a new life. This topic is it could be considered something well known from the average citizen, but it's not the reality, because sometimes there are challenges linked to the bilingual people, especially for the bilingual families, which who don't know which language they should use. It is right to switch or change from one language to another in the middle of the dialogues, and this is the topic of tonight's conference. We will, with the analysis of Professor Parafita-Couto, she will look at how it is possible and it is an advantage to mix up and to speak several languages at the same time. It's not a problem, as it's something that is most of the time an advantage. But let me introduce the coordinator of the series, Dr. Julio Villa Garcia, who is currently senior lecturer of the Spanish linguistics and syntax, in the Department of Linguistics and English Language at the University of Manchester. In the course of his PhD at the University of Connecticut, was trained as a theoretical statistician and as a language acquisitionist, working with the framework of minimalism. His current interests lie in the areas of Spanish Romance and English linguistics. Other interests include also child language acquisition, bilingualism, and the application of theoretical linguistics research to the foreign second language pedagogy. So thank you very much again. I hope you will enjoy the lecture. And without further ado, I give you the floor, Julio. Thank you. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, gracias, Pedro. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the last talk of this year of the bilingualism series of the Instituto Cervantes of Manchester and Leeds. It's really an honor and a privilege to introduce Maria Carmen Parafita-Couto, somebody I really look up to and somebody who is, I think, a role model for many of us. Carmen is originally from the northwest part of Spain, Galicia. She did her undergraduate degree at the University of Santiago de Compostela. She read English philology, so she's an expert on English studies. And Carmen has been all over the place. In fact, she received her PhD from the University of Kansas in 2005. Then she worked as an assistant professor at Kenyon College in the United States. Then she relocated to Europe. More specifically, she worked as a researcher at Bangor University, also in Glasgow. And in the last years, she's been working as a university lecturer at Leiden University in the Netherlands. She collaborates with many people around the world. She's been the recipient of many grants. She's done a whole lot of publications in syntax, and especially lately bilingualism, with special reference to code switching, about which we will hear a lot tonight. And well, Carmen is just a very hardworking person. She's a multitasker. She's great at administration. She's great at teaching. She's great at research. And as we will see today, she's great also at delivering talks. And we are here to listen to her. It's, as I said, a real pleasure. Thank you, everyone. And well, Carmen, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us. Gracias. Graciñas.
Graciñas, Julio. Thank you for this very kind introduction, and also for letting me be part of this really nice series that you're organizing, Pedro and Julio. I'll share my screen. Okay, so what I'm going to do for the next 40 minutes or so is to reflect on what it means to be multilingual. Oops, it looks like I cannot. Oh yeah, I can switch slides. So you probably have never wondered, or maybe you have, how many languages are there in the world. And there are over 7,000 languages spoken today. The number is constantly changing in flux because we are learning more and more about the world's languages every day. So the question that is relevant for us today in this presentation is, what does it mean to live in a world with thousands of languages? Okay, so here we have a Kinder Egg, and I used to love them as a kid. I confess I still like them today. When you open the yellow capsule to find the surprise inside, you also find a sheet of paper, and you have a scan of the sheet of paper here. And the sheet of paper contains a warning message. You have the English one here. Warning, read and keep, toy not suitable for children under 3 years. Small parts might be swallowed or inhaled. So if you look carefully, packed into this tiny slip of paper are at least 37 different languages in 8 different scripts. So this seems quite impressive, but remember that there are over 7,000 languages spoken in the world. So actually the Kinder Egg message can only be translated into a tiny fraction of these 7,000 languages. And when we look at it in this way, the message sheet starts to look quite linguistically poor, actually. So who decides what languages should be included in this leaflet? So this illustrates how these decisions about language, about communication, aren't actually so simple. At the same time, using language to communicate is what we do as humans. So how are we able to communicate if we speak so many different languages, right? You might be familiar with the story of the Tower of Babel. This is a painting by the famous Dutch painter, Peter Bruegel the Elder. And this story tries to explain why the people in the world speak different languages. In this story from the Bible, humans originally spoke a single language. And God got angry when they tried to build a tower to go to heaven. This was not in God's plan, so he made humans speak different languages and scattered them across the earth, right? So humans were divided into linguistic groups, unable to communicate with each other. And this is something that stayed to this day, this idea that we have language borders, right? That are hard, that you cannot cross. Peter Maskin mentioned this in his 2000 book. He says that laymen and linguists alike share the image of a language as a closely guarded separate unit, as a fortress. Yeah. So there are hard borders between languages that cannot be crossed by the speakers. But the question that I'm going to ask today is this the case? Can language borders actually never be crossed? So even when we look only at the languages that have been officialized as the national language of different countries, we can observe in this map that I'm showing you now that for the countries with a stripe pattern, that actually multilingualism is prevalent, right? And even within country borders, right, across the world. So in addition to the number of official languages, there are also, in many countries, languages that coexist, right, in contact with them. So there is migration movements that contribute to making societies multilingual. There are native languages that are not official, etc. So the majority of the world population is actually multilingual. So let's zoom here into a big metropolis. This is a map of New York's Twitter languages. So you see the tag tweets as a proxy of the languages used in the city of New York, right? And you see that there are a lot of tweets in English, but also in Spanish, in Portuguese, in Japanese, in Russian, etc. And if you look at London, you see a similar picture with slightly different languages, but you see the multilingualism is present in this series. Now, Manchester, I should have been there if it was possible to travel. Manchester is also very multilingual. And I was actually lucky to live in Manchester when I did an Erasmus year about 20 years ago already. And if you walk around Manchester, you see signs in many different languages. And this linguistic mosaic has come about through generations of migration. According to the Multilingual Manchester website, there are about 150 languages spoken in Manchester. But multilingualism is not only a characteristic of urban and international settings like New York or London or Manchester. So multilingualism also happens in more rural areas. And different to what happens in these big cities that proliferate in the context of migration, globalization, in rural multilingual situations, we have highly multilingual individuals who speak or sign or understand a high number of languages, right? So let me give you an example by focusing on the lower Casamance region of southern Senegal. And this is a case study that is mentioned in an article by Lupke and colleagues. This is an example of the linguistic trajectory of a 30-year-old speaker from this area in southern Senegal. This is a region that is characterized by extremely high levels of linguistic diversity and complex patterns of multilingualism, both at the individual and also at the societal level. So what you see in this map is basically an illustration on how the speaker built his repertoire, right? So the speaker moved between several villages that are associated with different languages. And the speaker is only 30 and he moved throughout these villages, a lot of them before the age of 12 already. So his repertoire comprises languages that are closely related, that they are very similar in a way, and also languages that are quite different, including also two Romance languages. You can see there French and Portuguese, you can see Creole, and you can see Yola, etc. So the linguistic biography of this person that is described in this article is quite typical of the region, right? Okay, so despite the fact that multilingualism is so common across communities, we tend to take language boundaries for granted. Language socialization and ideology, the general global ideology that we have that languages are separate, reinforces this idea of having language boundaries through life. We know separate languages, but is it really not possible to cross language borders? So I will now show you a few videos to demonstrate that speakers in different communities seem to have little problem producing utterances using elements of their different languages. So now you will hear the beginning of a song that was a hit here, big hit here in the Netherlands as well as in Suriname a few years ago. And you see a mix of Hindustani, Creole, and Dutch. Kofi Jabko has provided subtitles for the song, but they are not subtitles of what the actual what it says in the song, but the languages. So it's language marking, right? So let me play the beginning for you. Okay, so this should have given you an idea of how easy it is, in this song at least, to go back and forth between all these languages. 3 languages are mixed in the song. Oops, I'm going to, it's not letting me move. Okay, now here I'll show you an interview with a multilingual speaker from Northern Belize in Central America. And I'd like to thank Osmer Balan for providing this video. Now, even if you don't understand Spanish, you will be able to detect how often the speaker goes back and forth between her languages.
Well, for me personally, it's El September celebration. Mostly because nosotros hacemos preparations towards it. I mean, yo salgo con carnivals and things. When it comes to New Year's or Valentine, it's algo que solo, like, you know, se hace celebrate, pero no es algo que we push, well, at least in mi caso, we don't push for preparations compared to September. I mean, in September celebration, nosotros empezamos preparations desde June. Empezando con el float from the costumes y todo eso, ese gather up, todo eso. Bueno, esa es una de nuestras major celebrations. Y los friends que yo tengo ahorita, todos nosotros somos carnival.
This is just to give you an idea of how people speak in Northern Belize. And now I'm going to show you that this is not just something that happens with adults in these communities. Children sometimes also mix, a lot of the times actually mix, if they are exposed to multiple languages. So here we're going to see an Indonesian, French, English trilingual child. And we will see that the mother speaks in Indonesian, the father speaks in French and in English, and the child answers using all 3 languages.
Apa yang rusak, Jo?
This one. That one.
Kenapa? Oh, celananya bolong. Kok bisa bolong?
Aku dah tahu kenapa bolong.
Kenapa bolong? Kenapa
Okay.
Papa bolong?
Fix it then. Tiens, tu répares?
Je peux pas.
Comment ça, tu ne peux pas?
There's no more there.
Okay. Okay, so the errors that I have just shown you in these videos, from the intense code switching that you saw in the song in Suriname, the interview in Belize, and also from the child mixing, points out to the fact that it's probably not so difficult for humans to cross language borders. And Adbacus already pointed out that in situations when there is little normative pressure, mixing is common and seems to happen quite effortlessly. So it's not really costly for us to mix languages. But it is precisely because of this normative pressure and the monoglot ideology that dominates many societies, Occidental societies in particular, that mixing is considered to be bad, a contamination of the individual systems. People believe that it implies that you don't know the languages properly, and you have a few quotes here in this slide to illustrate that, right? So the multilingual skills that allow people to switch from one language to another or to mix languages are often actually considered more of a problem than an asset. And there is then no surprise that these multilingual speakers are often punished or condemned, and they are characterized by using pejorative terms like sometimes Spanglish or Hinglish or Taglish. You probably know many of these terms that are used to characterize code switching. But this is far from the reality, right? Already in the 80s, Sanat Poplak studied the speech of Puerto Ricans in New York, known as New Yorkans, and so that these speakers that code switch the most are those who actually have higher proficiencies in both languages. So code switching is a sign of bilingual ability. It's not it's not a deficiency. And this is also something that attracted the attention of a Puerto Rican comedian called Bill Santiago. He has been trying to fight the stigma associated with Spanglish. He's published a book pardon my Spanglish, and I'm going to show you very briefly an interview that he's done on CNN a few years back. And for those of you who don't understand Spanish, because this is in code switching, you have the relevant translation into English here on the slide.
I am sorry por la mezcla de languages, porque ahora is joining me Bill Santiago, comedian and autor del libro Pardon My Spanglish, un libro very, very funny, but con un sentido very serious. Me salió bien, Bill. Bienvenido.
Bastante bien, pero ¿por qué te disculparte? Si el Spanglish es algo que merece un poquito más de respeto, uno no se tiene que disculpar por usarlo.
Okay, so he's just pointing out that you should not apologize for mixing languages, for using Spanglish.
I am sorry.
Okay, so you shouldn't apologize. And in fact, we know that code switching is not random, it's rule governed. Like any other instantiation of language, right? It's not different from producing unilingual speech. So what I'm going to do is illustrate briefly how code switching is not random, with attention to what happens when people mix articles and nouns from different languages. So the house. So what happens when the determiner, the comes from one language and house comes from the other language, as well as what happens when people mix within the verbal domain. So when you have, for example, is painting, and the is comes from one language and the painting comes from the other language. So let's start with determinants and nouns. So no one will doubt that the house is grammatical or acceptable, or is a good English phrase. And la casa is also grammatical in Spanish, right? But what happens when people code switch? Then we have different options, different logical options. So we can have English determiner with a Spanish noun, de casa, or we can have Spanish determiner with an English noun, la house. We could also have a Spanish determiner, in this case, masculine, with an English noun. So we have different logical options. How can we find out what is possible and what is not possible, right? Different linguistic theories make different predictions about what is possible, but we don't have time to get into all the theoretical details. All I'm going to tell you is that Hans Stadthagen and I, a couple of years ago, asked 40 bilinguals from the southwest of the US, and we found a striking pattern. Both combinations are possible. So we can have Spanish determiners and English determiners, as long as the determiner and the verb are in the same language. So when the determiner and the verb are not in the same language, that the speakers don't like it. They do like it when the determiner and the verb are in the same language. So we see this pattern. This was from asking people about their judgments, but with Jeffrey Bloxile and Margaret Duker, we looked at what speakers do when they speak to each other in everyday conversations. And we studied 30 hours of spontaneous conversations in Miami and compare to what happened in spontaneous conversations between speakers of the English Creole in Nicaragua, the English-Spanish bilinguals in Bluefields, Nicaragua. And we saw that indeed speakers in both Nicaragua and Miami adhere to what we saw in the judgment. So the determiner and the noun come from the same language. So vio el house, for example, in Miami, and sol de casa in Bluefields. However, what we did see as well is that Nicaraguan speakers always produce verbs and determiners from English, inserting nouns from Spanish. And in Miami, the trend was the reverse. So the verbs and the nouns were from Spanish, the verbs and the determiners were from Spanish with insertions from English. So we saw a difference in the directionality of switching that we can perhaps explain if we pay attention to the differences, the social differences across these communities. So one possibility would be that speakers tend to code switch when they are speaking the minority language in that community, which would be the English Creole in Nicaragua and the Spanish in Miami, and then insert elements from the language that is more prestigious. So Spanish in Nicaragua and English in Miami. So we see both a combination of structural factors and social factors that help us determine what happens in these communities. Okay, we saw together with Marianne Goldberg, we saw exactly the same pattern here in the Netherlands with Papiamento Dutch bilinguals. Papiamento Dutch bilinguals insert elements from Dutch into their Papiamento, right? And we also looked at what happens with Welsh English bilinguals. And again, we saw that they tend to prefer inserting elements from English into their Welsh than the other way around. So again, we see the same structural combinations, the determiners and the verbs from the same language, but the effect of the social factors that seem to account for the patterns we see in production at any cost. So let's now zoom into Miami, and I like to talk about this construction, the determinant noun construction mixed. So the grammatical features that we see here for Spanish and English are not compatible, exactly compatible at the switch juncture, right? Spanish nouns encode for grammatical gender, English do not. English nouns do not encode for grammatical gender. So when a speaker uses a determiner from Spanish with an English noun, they need to make a choice as to what gender they're going to choose. And what we see here is that the speaker chose masculine gender for house, which in Spanish would be feminine. So just briefly, for those of you who don't know Spanish, Spanish has a binary gender system, masculine and feminine, and this system is relatively transparent. So word endings are usually an indicator of the gender of the word, although not always. So here we have libro ending in O, which is masculine, and revista ending in A, which is feminine, right? Given the possible permutations that we could have for Spanish-English mixing, so we could have el book, we could have el magazine, we could have la magazine, so we could have a masculine or a feminine determiner. So what will speakers choose, right? They could use the gender of the translation equivalent, so you could say la magazine, because magazine is feminine in Spanish, or perhaps they could use the default gender strategy and use el magazine. These are some examples from Miami, and you perhaps noticed that there is a clear pattern. So while oats es un healthy store, sí, fíjate, eso no es una cosa que tiene que hacer el town of Miami Lakes, etc. So we see that independently of the gender of the translation equivalent, in all these cases it would be feminine, the speaker uses the masculine form el, right? And in fact, this has been observed to be the case in different communities, in Miami by Jorge Valdez-Croft, and in Belize by Osmer Balan. And what is interesting is that even when the word has biological feminine gender, for example, Balan reports on examples such as El Big Sister or even El Virgin Mary, right? So even when there is a feminine biological gender, the masculine is still used, right? So this trend is actually so strong in some communities that people may say things like this: Spanglish knows no gender. But it doesn't mean that people who code switch don't know gender, or they don't know gender in Spanish. And in fact, in a different study, we looked at 7 to 10-year-old children in Miami, and we found that when they are speaking Spanish, they use both masculine and feminine gender, just like adults do. They, so when they speak Spanish, they use masculine and feminine. And when they code switch between Spanish and English, they tend to default to the masculine, just like the adults in that community. So they would say la flor, and then they would go and say el flower. So it looks like these children, by age 7 already, they have learned the patterns that are conventional in the community, both for the unilingual Spanish mode, for the English mode, and for the code switching mode. And this conventionalization we can also see in another study led by Betty Martinez that compare different communities, Granada, State College, San Juan, and El Paso. And what we saw here was that there are differences across the communities, and 2 of the communities used the default, just like in Miami and in Belize, more than the other 2 communities. Those were State College and Puerto Rico in particular. What was common to those 2 communities is that they code-switched. The code-switching frequency was higher, right? So one possible explanation is that the more the bilinguals engage in code-switching, the greater the tendency would be to assign the default masculine gender. So this is important because it supports the observation, right? That code-switching preferences reflect community norms. And yeah, we cannot necessarily generalize what will happen across bilingual populations, right? Given that we might have the same language pair in different bilingual populations, we still have to pay attention to the community norms that get established in each community. This is no different from saying we have regional variation in language in general. We talk about Peninsular Spanish, Caribbean Spanish, Mancunian English, Australian English, etc. So it's no difference really. So with this in mind, let's see what happens with another language pair, so Spanish and Basque, Español. What is interesting about Basque and Spanish is, like English, Basque has no gender. However, the terminers are attached to the noun, as you can see on the slide. So the word for I, beggy. So you have beggy and then the determiner a, right? And you will also notice that in Spanish, the final a is usually associated with a marker of feminine gender, right? So what we saw in a study a few years ago is that what the speakers did was quite surprising for us, was that they used the feminine determiner with the Basque noun, even when the translation equivalent was masculine. So la eguzkia, Spanish would be masculine, soul, la liburua, Spanish libro, book, masculine. And this happened even with biological gender masculine. So la osaba, uncle, would still be used in the feminine form, right? Perhaps unsurprisingly, given what I told you already, is that the way we explain it is that the Basque determiner, that is suffix to the noun, was probably reinterpreted as a marker of feminine gender. And this is what we reported in a particular subcommunity of speakers in the Basque country. But we know the linguistic profile also matters. So we don't find the same patterns across all speakers. The speakers who learn the gender language first tend to be the ones that use the gender of the translation equivalent. So those speakers that might have learned Spanish first or Basque first are those that might use the translation equivalent, and rather than say el house, they might say la house. And then we found this across different language pairs, not only Spanish English and Spanish Basque. We also found this with Purepecha Spanish, etc. So we think that there is some interaction of bilingualism profile and community norms playing a role here, right? Another fascinating feature of multilingualism is that they can create, multilinguals can create new structures that do not exist in their separate languages, right? So this is why I want to move now to the verbal domain. So in English, you might say the boy is painting the house. In Spanish, you may say el chico está pintando la casa. And you might then switch between the auxiliary and the verb and say he's pintando or está painting. But it's also being observed that in some communities, the speakers might use a verb, hacer, do, to incorporate verbs from English. The first pattern has a structural templates in both English and Spanish. It's basically the same, you just switch the lexical item. But the second pattern has no structural equivalence in either English or Spanish. So this is a new creation. Now, what we found when we compare what happens in 3 different communities that are geographically separate in Puerto Rico, Belize, and New Mexico, we compare the use and acceptability of these constructions. And we found that in Puerto Rico, only the pattern that is shared with Spanish and English, that exists in both Spanish and English, is accepted and is used. So está painting, right? But the hacer, the creative construction, is interesting. It's the most used in Belize and is the most preferred as well. And the other pattern, está painting, is also accepted, but is used to a much lesser extent. And this preference is reversed in New Mexico, right? So once again, we see different patterns and preferences across communities. So let's go back to the story of the Tower of Babel and the existence of language borders. I hope that I have shown you that when there is no normative pressure to keep the language separate, speakers just use the resources that they have acquired. And if they know the interlocutor has the same resources, that the interlocutor also knows the same language, then code switching might be normal, and language separation might not be the norm in these cases. There is actually some recent neuroscientific evidence by Edith Kang and colleagues in Florida that support the view that the way bilinguals control their languages can be modulated by the interlocutor, right? By the knowledge of the languages that the interlocutor share with them. There's also recent evidence by Sarah Phillips and Lina Pilcanning at NYU in the USA that the brain uses shared mechanisms for combining words from a single language and for combining words from different languages. And they did this with Korean English bilinguals. So our brains don't seem to care too much about the languages. So it looks like we have adopted an ideology that assumes the cognitive and social reality of language boundaries too easily. And to this end, Adbacus has been saying that the boundaries between languages are not hard, but rather they are porous. Yeah? Janine Trafford-Deller says that our languages live apart together. So we can separate them, but we can also mix them. So we are seeing more and more evidence that perhaps mixing is not so effortful, but keeping languages separate is what is costly. So maybe what we need explaining is how do multilinguals actually avoid mixing rather than why do they mix, right? But just to finish, I think one way to avoid the Babel curse is to learn some of the multiple languages that exist in the world. And this is what Keith Kahn Harris advocates in this brand new book, which has just come out, and maybe some of you who are in the UK have seen it. The book didn't make it to the Netherlands yet. I'm looking forward to receiving it. I hope that I have shown you that the curse that disperses the humankind in the biblical story of Babel could never work, right? Because humans are not necessarily monolingual. And in fact, humans are capable of learning, knowing, and using more than one language. This is a trait that is unheard of in other species with communicative systems, right? So given that this is an inherent feature of the human language faculty, we are all, we are all multilingual to a certain extent, as we know different dialects, different registers, etc. So linguistic diversity does not really constitute an obstacle in the path of human cooperation. So we can really learn all these languages and overcome this curse of the Tower of Babel. And also, we should not be scared of mixing the languages. In fact, mixing is not a curse, but a sign of multilingual ability. And the Kinder Egg message has just recently been translated to Llanito. Llanito is the name that the Spanglish spoken in Gibraltar receives. It's the label that is used for the mixture between Spanish and English spoken in Gibraltar. And there you have the translation from the Kinder Egg warning into Llanito. So with this, I'd like to finish and thank you very much. And I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Carmen. And this has been a delightful talk, and I'm pretty sure that this sentiment is shared by all the attendees, and it will be shared by those watching us later on YouTube. It's been wonderful, very inspirational, a lot of topics for research, you know, for those of us who are linguists. And well, the floor is open for questions from the audience. Really, thank you, Carmen. Wonderful
Thank you.
talk. I think we're all still digesting all the
I will ask
information.
just question myself. May I put your one question to my
Absolutely, Pedro, go ahead.
Yes, the message is very clear. The positive thing is to learn new languages and also to mix them. My question is, when you get used to mixing the languages, at the end cannot be a difficulty, especially for children, by this process of mixing all the time, not to be able to differentiate and to write properly, for instance, in Spanish, English. When you are in an informal atmosphere, family, friends, all right? But if you are used to being a code switching reality most of the time, would not be a disadvantage for the children afterwards to write properly in two languages?
Right, that's a very good point. Thank you for that question. So I think, you know, again, this is the ideology of the separation that we have. So writing properly means writing in what we know is Spanish, what we know is English, what we know is Welsh, and mixing is wrong, right? But a lot of the times when we go to school, we learn to separate the languages, right? So that socialization helps us with the separation. It is true that if you are in a society where you might not be schooled in those languages, then you cannot so easily, I mean, it's not just a matter of separating the languages, it's a matter of also learning how to write, the orthography, etc. So if I talk to colleagues from Belize that tell me that in Belize, the video that I show you, speakers code switch all the time, they mix the languages all the time, and yet it is true that they have trouble sometimes inhibiting this code switching when they speak with monolingual speakers, when let's say they go to the US or they go to Mexico. But this is because they're not used to actually separating the languages, right? So I think we have to think about that, right? So what is good is what we as society thinks is good, right? And if we are supposed to, if we have education that tells us, that teaches us how to write in Spanish, how to write in English, then I think we should be fine. We can learn that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll read out a couple of questions on the chat for you, Carmen. One by Tina Lonsdale goes as follows. Would adjectives go in the order of the noun adjective order of the nouns language? For instance, casa blue or blue casa. There is a cafe actually called the Azul Monkey, and it seems Monkey Azul feels better.
Yeah, thank you. That's again, this is a switch point in which I have done quite a lot of work as well. And it's a difficult one because we've done work on this looking at Spanish English. Welsh English has exactly the same kind of conflict where Welsh has post-nominal adjectives and English has prenominal adjectives. Papiamento Dutch, exactly the same. And we've looked at production data, we looked at judgment data, we even did some neuro scientific work with this. We did some EEG studies, and the evidence is not so clear. So what we see is that in production, bilinguals don't seem to like to switch in this point. But when they do switch, what they do is they have a sentence, let's say in Spanish, and they insert a noun from English, right? And in that case, you would get monkey azul. Now, if you had a sentence from English with the insertion from Spanish, then you'll probably get blue so you get, I forget, blue mono, right? And then what we see when we have sometimes we see, when we have the adjectives inserted, so this is when nouns are inserted, when the adjectives are inserted, indeed, we would get, whenever we have an English sentence, we might have azul then in post-nominal position, so following the order of Spanish, and we would have blue in pre-nominal position, following the adjective order. But this is rather complex. So you have to take into account what word is actually inserted, not just the code switching. So you have to look at the entire sentence. Yeah, and the evidence is a bit. The evidence that we have is not big enough to know what happens. Yeah, we are still working on this across different communities.
Excellent, Carmen.
Yes.
Cristobal Gutierrez Torrubia asks the following question regarding the Babel curse that you mentioned and the mixing of languages in our multilingual brain. Is there any evidence about this popular idea that when you learn a second or third language whose writing is different from the first one, for instance, Spanish and Hebrew or Japanese, for instance, the mixing actually becomes less frequent?
Thank you for that question. I don't think that this is necessarily the case, because usually language mixing is an oral phenomenon, right? So I mean, there is no evidence. There's a lot of Japanese English code switching, Chinese English code switching, Chinglish, right? So I don't think that the writing system prevents people from actually mixing languages. Arabic English, yeah. So it's mainly an oral phenomenon, even though more and more we are seeing it in written form as well, right?
Excellent, Carmen. Thank you very much. I will now read out the question by McGrath. Does it also benefit speakers of indigenous languages who may be at risk of languages which may be at risk of disappearing under the threat of being replaced by languages such as Spanish or English, you know, to mix the use of the indigenous language with Spanish or English? Would this be a way of language maintenance?
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, and a point that has been made in the past as well. So it's better to mix them than not to use the minority or the endangered language, right? And we also know that when you mix languages, you tend to be quite proficient in both languages. So it should not be a problem, right? So I'm just within the question, it says, maybe under the threat of being replaced by languages such as Spanish or English. Yeah, so I think it is overall is beneficial because you are maintaining the language to a certain extent. And we know that in most cases, I mean, this language separation is really almost an utopia, right? In most bilingual populations, people mix. When I used to live in Wales, maybe people would tell you that they don't mix, but when you hear it around you, they would mix, right? And what we saw when we looked at code switching is that people that said they wouldn't mix and that they found it a negative theme for the language maintenance, for the wealth, they actually did mix a lot. But their wealth was not affected by the mixing. It was not prejudiced by this mixing. Yeah.
Wonderful, Carmen. So there is a question by Hagen about the first song that you played using Hindi, right? So do the sentences of the song make sense, or was it just used for rhyming purposes? And this person comments that many of the recent songs released in the United Kingdom that use both English and Spanish seem to make a full sense in terms of grammaticality and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it was Hindustani, Creole, and Dutch. And I must admit that I don't understand Hindustani and the Creole from Suriname. So I would have to ask whether the sentences actually made sense. I would assume they did, but I don't understand those languages. I just used the song for illustrative purposes. But yeah, I could have used Spanish or English, and yeah, it would be the same. Yeah.
Right. So Carmen, maybe if you can do the research for them, they can they can find you.
I will. Yeah.
Find out, right?
Exactly. And Kofi Japko, who is also a linguist, was the one who coded this song according to the languages. So I will make sure that I ask him. Yeah, he should know the answer to that question. Yeah.
Superb. Irantu Epelde wants to inquire a little bit about Galician Spanish code switching.
Yeah, thank you, Irantu. I don't know what to tell you about Galician Spanish code switching, other than Galician and Spanish are closely related languages. So sometimes it might be a bit more difficult to decide what what word is from Spanish and what word is from Galician, right? We might see a lot of code switching more at between sentences or turns. So it's very common for one person to speak in Spanish and the other one to answer in Galician, and maybe then that person will switch to Galician or vice versa. But this type of switching within the sentence boundaries, let's say, it's a bit more difficult because the lexical items are very, very similar. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done on code switching between closely related languages. It's a bit more difficult to identify the switch points, let's say, within the sentence level.
In fact, in line with Irantu's question, and Carmen, I feel like we are in a similar situation because I speak Asturian, which might not be official yet, but it's still a language, a historical dialect of Latin, and it's obviously very similar to Spanish and to Galician. So many times the question I have in my mind is my father, or am I myself, am I just borrowing a word from Asturian into my Spanish, or is this really syntax? Is this really code switching? I guess this is not a simple question, right? It's not a black or white answer that it deserves.
Oh, it's not really so black and white. Also because, we have again, the norm, right? And for example, for Spanish and Galician, what is supposed to be the Galician word for something, which might not be the word that a native Galician speaker has acquired, right? So I can tell you, for example, for the sidewalk, right? In Spanish, you say acera. In Galician, you're supposed to say beira-rua, but I learned acera and I'm a Galician native speaker. So am I code switching to Spanish when I'm saying acera? I don't think so, because my lexicon acera is the same for Spanish and Galician. So you have to take that at the individual level and what have speakers been exposed to. Yeah, so deciding what's a code switch and what is not is difficult in these situations.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in fact, I always say, because of you, gracias. And then lately, several Galician people tell me, well, we also say gracias, to be honest. there's nothing wrong with gracias in our Galician.
No. Yeah, indeed. I mean, for me, gracias is fine. Gracias is fine. Grazas, which is the more standard version, is something that I've never used as a native speaker. So I know it's there in the standard, but yeah. So
it's interesting that you mentioned that, because in Asturian we can say el miel, the honey, or la miel. And you know, my cousins in a nice WhatsApp group that we have, they are a lot of fun, and many times I say, oh, I'm feeling a bit sick today, you know, sorry, a bit ill, my throat is hurting, I'm gonna have some el miel. And one of them even asked me, but weren't you a professor of linguistics? What do you mean el miel? And I say, oh, go to the Asturian dictionary. But you know, for many of us in, for instance, Avilés, which is not like a rural part of Asturias, el miel is really impossible. It's just in the dictionary, and certainly you can hear it in Grau, for instance, hamlets around Oviedo, but it's not something that we would normally say in my area. You know, we would say la miel, like in Spanish, but it's still Asturian, I guess.
Yeah. El miel.
Well, if there are no more questions, thank you, Carmen, thank you, Julio. It was really, really interesting. And the most interesting thing about this whole series is that there are always so many questions that we could ask every day. And with those lectures, we try to give some answers that are not mathematics, because there are always different possible interpretations, but in any case, it's always very enriching, and it was fantastic. Thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you, Julio. And it's a pleasure. It's the 5th event of this series, and next year we will continue, and we will announce our new program very soon. Thank you very much. And,
thank you.
See you soon. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.